Welcome to this panel, a 6 o'clock panel that doesn't have the word Brexit in, and yet is broadly a full room, so already it's going well. Welcome to ThinkTent. The ThinkTent, as you probably know, is a collaboration between the IEA, Taxpayers Alliance and three of the most exciting think tanks and campaign groups in the kind of conservative world. Different agendas, but broadly moving towards I think we describe it as a sort of centre-right free market world. But as part of that, we have to accept the fact that we are part of a bigger world. And that's what we're here to talk about today. I am Andy Silvester, I'm the head of PR at the Sun newspaper. I also occasionally write leaders. So if you ever wonder what the voice of the Sun looks like, it's a floppy-haired 30-year-old. We are here to discuss foreign aid, specifically how do we get value from the international aid budget, which, as I think most of you in this room will know, especially those of you with Taxpayers Alliance lanyards, will know kicks in at about £14 billion a year. The reason for that, as you will also no doubt know, is that it is enshrined in law that we will spend 0.7% of gross national income on overseas development every single year. For the sake of the panel and for the sake of everybody who's feeling particularly pedanty this afternoon, if somebody says GDP rather than GNI, don't shout at them. We all know what they mean, okay? So we'll go from there. I will introduce the panel when they're about to speak rather than in one fell swoop now. When we get to questions, which we will do, I'll ask that you keep them to sort of questions rather than comments. If you do have any comments or longer speeches, I suggest you take it up with people afterwards. If you don't have anyone on the panel's contact details, I understand you can get them from the Tory conference app now. So do that afterwards, and we'll keep the questions quick and hopefully have a thrilling discussion. First panelist to speak to you probably needs very little introduction from me. It's the Right Honourable Priti Patel MP for Witham since 2010, a Minister under David Cameron in the Treasury and DWP, and of course Secretary of State for International Development in 2016-2017. Over to you, Priti. How do we get value from the aid budget?
Andy, thank you very much, and I'm so impressed that so many of you were here at this time this evening for party conference, but actually engaged in this debate. Value for money is, one of those striking concepts that sits within the DNA of conservatism and at the heart of what we as conservatives stand for. And that effectively speaks to the whole agenda of financial and fiscal accountability, transparency, recognising that the money is not government's money, but it's actually your dosh, your cash, from the outset. And so, Andy, to answer your question, I think there are several things that we should seek to do. And the good news is we are doing as well in terms of getting aid effectiveness and value for money out of our DFID budget, or the ODA budget, as I used to call it. And I think it's just important just to get some facts out there, actually. So we've already heard about 0.7 and the 14 billion. I think it's quite important to recognise that DFID as a government department, the Department for International Development, is not solely responsible for the entirety of that budget. Not everybody know that, that's just a fact. DFID manages, I think, about 74% of the overall budget. It's high, it is a lot, and the remaining 26% is shared across other government departments, including, wait for it, DEFRA, the Department of Health, the Foreign Office and the MOD, and we have something called the Csf Fund, which is the Conflict Stabilisation Security Fund as well, which is a really important fund. It takes care of things like stability, peace, security in some of the most incredible hotspots in the world, basically. But this money is also leveraged and used with regards to our national security strategy. So it's very, very significant. And as an internationalist, I think it's important that we, invest accordingly, but make important choices. So look, in terms of how do we get value, the answer is it's through reform, changing policies, refreshing policies, and making that we are constantly, or ensuring as ministers in DFID, but in other government departments, scrutinising where that money goes. That's quite a tough job. That is quite a difficult job to do. I can only give you the examples of what I did in my time in DFID. I had line-by-line financial review. I've got a financial background and I quite like following money. My mantra was following money, people, outcomes. Closing programmes that don't necessarily deliver in our national interest, we did a bit of that. Cutting out something like £1.2 billion just by closing, I think, 126 programmes that I felt should have been closed. There are many more, in my view, that also should have been closed. But at the same time, I think now, in terms of value and long-term value, looking at how we spend money, and this is the area that we do not speak about at all within the multilateral aspect, how we spend through multinational organisations, development banks, for example. We park a lot of your money in banks around the world, including the World Bank, African Development Bank, Caribbean Infrastructure Bank, the Infrastructure Bank in China. There are many of these banks, yet we cannot necessarily, we don't have oversight of how that money is spent. And I think there is a lot of work that now needs to take place in terms of scrutinising that money and actually putting policies in place to make sure that we drive aid effectiveness. People speak about just cutting budgets. Well, you can do that, but actually the legislation prevents you from, just stopping spending money. I think we should actually change some of the policies around multinational institutions through the multilateral system. I should have mentioned the United Nations as well, where last year we conditioned 30% of the money because of all the sex abuse that was taking place. So, there are not enough accountability still. It pains me to say this, but when it comes to development and aid, there is an entire industry that's built out there, and I think that's very controversial. Aid should be spent or invested into saving people's lives, transforming people's lives. I was speaking today earlier on about the humanitarian support we're giving to Indonesia. There's been a terrible earthquake there, and I think that's right. We are a very generous country and we should be doing that. But then at the same time, I think we need to do much, much more to leverage the overall aid budget, and by that I mean the entire 0.7, yes, across government departments, but make every government department accountable, perhaps through line-by-line spending reviews, which actually is what I commissioned when I was in DFID, and I demanded that of the other government departments too. In fact, when I was at Party Conference last year, that was part of one of my speech points as well. But on top of that, looking at how we can bring accountability to the big institutions, the development banks, the United Nations, the World Bank, all these big institutions where our money is parked. My final point on this is that I also think that we should not necessarily automatically replenish many of the big funds and the big organisations without overall scrutiny. I'm going to give you one example. On my first day when I walked into DFID, back in 2016, I had an extraordinary submission put in front of me. It was like that, and I can read paperwork and I can do numbers and I know a bit about money. And in that submission, this is day one in the job, okay, so just think about this. I was asked to sign off £900 million as part of something which is really important actually, which is the Global Fund. The Global Fund is a big international fund that supports drugs and research and development into tuberculosis and HIV/AIDS around the world. Really important fund. And I turned around and said, absolutely no bloody way. It's my first day in the role and I should go away and find out more about this. But we did something else. We didn't do £900 million. We actually halved it because I did a deal with Mr. Gates, Bill Gates and others in the private sector, and I said if I put in X amount, I expect the private sector to step up and put in the remaining contributions basically, and we'll work together. And I don't think, the aid budget should solely be about governments putting your money in. We should be getting much more out of the private sector, doing much more through things such as development bonds, social impact bonds, and in my case, my big policy that I focused on when I was in DFID was looking at the City of London becoming the development finance hub of the world, where we could basically use a lot more in terms of international finance and institutions to catalyse financial markets to put money into development. So I'm going to leave it there for now. We'll talk about this for a long time.
Yeah, we certainly could. Line-by-line scrutiny. There's a line to warm the hearts of many a Taxpayers Alliance supporter, I dare say.
Spreadsheets.
Yeah, quite. Spreadsheets. Need more of them. Next panellist is Ian Birrell, to my left, who is not just one of Britain's foremost experts on matters such as this, but probably one of the world's foremost experts. Worked and reported from more than 50 odd countries. A foreign correspondent, contributing editor at Mail on Sunday, and a man who's written very compellingly on the need to look at the way we do international aid, both from a perspective of what it does on the ground, as well as how appropriate it is to spend a certain amount of money every year, regardless of results, when we are still 35 to 40 odd billion quid in deficit. Ian, over to you.
I can see why he does PR for the Sun, because that was the best billing I've ever had. But this is also a very easy thing, isn't it? How do we get better value from the aid budget? Simple, abandon the stupid target. How can you have a target where we give 0.7% of GNI every year when poverty is declining and the sums are rising all the time? It is the politics of the madhouse. It's as simple as that. Let's not forget, what are the origins of this target? People never ask what are the origins of this target. The origins of this target are that a bunch of campaigners began to make some calculations back using data from the 1940s in the 1960s. They eventually persuaded it to become an internationally recognised benchmark in the 1970s. Now, some economists at a think tank that's actually funded by DFID, because most things you find around the world are funded by DFID, had a look at this, and they took the economy, of course, in 1970 was rather smaller than the economy today, and they had a look at it in 2005. So that's 13 years ago. And they found that when you took the same calculations and applied them to the economy of 2005, the figure should have been actually 0.01%. And that was in 2005, so it's probably gone down significantly since then. It is utterly absurd, particularly in a country which is borrowing money to pay this, particularly in a country which is cutting back a lot of things here. I have a disabled child, and I can see that services are being crucified in this country, and the social care system is collapsing, and yet we're funding people from North Korea, officials from North Korea. We're giving money to Palestinian terrorists who've killed British citizens. How does this make sense? And is it any wonder that the public have lost faith in politics when the entire political classes come together to do this? Now, why do we do it? I used to be David Cameron's speechwriter. I know very well why we did it. We did it so the Conservatives would look compassionate. It was the Live Aid generation who thought this was a good way to connect with younger, trendier, metropolitan voters. Also, there was some machinations going on to get Britain, the chair, to come up with the next Millennium Development Goals, the SDGs, but that's a slightly separate matter. So, now I'm not one of those people who has a problem with spending money in foreign parts of the world. I spend a lot of my time, particularly in Africa, and clearly there are huge problems that need solving. There are huge issues there. The question is, what is the best way to do it? Should we listen to the last British Nobel Prize-winning economist? Should we listen to the President of Ghana? Or should we listen to politicians in Westminster and their cheerleading charities who are all getting very fat and doing very nicely off the back of it, and those fat cat consultants who are taking millions of pounds out into their own pockets while claiming to help the poor? Now, politicians always say that they're clamping down on waste. Don't believe it, they're not. The only time waste is ever clamped down on is when it's exposed, mainly by journalists. When Priti was there, I revealed that the biggest private contractor was manipulating, they got hold of illicitly documents so they could get bid advantage, and they misled MPs. They were struck off, but only because I exposed it. Why did the Oxfam scandal come out? Because the Times exposed it. And wherever you look, it's appalling. There's the fat cats who are getting fat off it in the industry, and it is an industry, and it's actually a corrupt industry. It's corrupt not in terms of necessarily stealing money and feathering their own nest. It's corrupt in the relationships between politicians, between charities, and between officials. DFID officials, by the way, are the highest paid in Whitehall. So we're funding terrorists, we're backing corruption, we're funding some of the most revolting regimes around the world, such as Rwanda, who we hold up to be heroes, development heroes, while they're sending hit squads to kill people in Britain, while they're raping and pillaging in the Congo, while they're creating civil war there. There are so many reasons. I went to Montserrat, where we spent £400 million in 20 years to help 5,000 people. At least for humanitarian aid down the table.
That's alive.
We spent £400 million in 20 years on 5,000 people, and they hadn't even built a new hospital after the earthquake, but they had built some beach bars. I mean, it is ridiculous, and behind it is a very fundamental question, which is, does it work? Professor Angus Dayton, the Nobel-winning economist who spent all his life looking at poverty and developing the metrics by which we measure poverty, 4 years ago, came to this conversion, and he suddenly realised that aid is actually doing more harm than good. We're undermining democracy. We talk about welfare dependency at home and we encourage it abroad. We're giving money to people who don't then have the motivation to respond to the needs of people on the ground. And that's why it's undermining democracy. We're helping corruption, we're fueling conflict, and it is just utterly, utterly mad politics. Thank you.
So Ian's on the fence. We talked about scrutiny, talked about charities. Our next panellist, Pauline Latham MP to my left, is right on the front line of that scrutiny work. And he also mentioned charities, and Pauline's done an awful lot of work in her role on the International Development Select Committee in Parliament, asking tough questions of people at Oxfam, Save the Children, and various others who've also been embroiled in scandals recently, which, when you look at the taxpayers' money being pushed into things that end with words like Caligula's orgy, you do have to wonder if things are going particularly well out there. Pauline's also been as well as sitting on the committee, is the MD since 2010 in Mid-Derbyshire, and over to you, Pauline.
Thank you very much. And whereas I do have sympathy with Ian's view, I do understand his view, I also back, so I probably am on the fence, I also back Priti's view, but I do think we need reform in there, and I think that what's happening now in DFID, there is reform happening and we are changing the way we do it. But I think we need to remember that the amount of money that DFID and the rest of government spend is absolutely nothing in comparison with the diaspora, who send more than that back to their individual countries, to their families. And my concern is that it doesn't seem to make a huge amount of difference. It does make a difference to individual families, but it doesn't lift a country out of poverty, although huge sums are going into many countries. It's not just Britain doing it, it's America, it's Denmark, it's European Union, of which a lot of that of course is our money, and they won't have that to spend after March next year. And I agree with Priti completely about the multilateral organisations. They do need more scrutiny. I have been at the forefront of the sex scandal, not me personally, but about exposing it.
The active news.
But when we went to talk to the World Bank about what they were doing about protecting women and girls within the bank, but also out in the field, they haven't even thought about it, which is quite shocking. So there are huge things that are wrong with what's going on in development, but there's an enormous amount of things that are right in international development, and I do think we can't abandon it. The 0.7% is an arbitrary figure, but if you think that out of every £100 the government has, it's only 70 pence. That is not very much money, although globally it is a huge sum. But it isn't an enormous amount of money, and there have been many millions of children vaccinated through the replenishment of the Global Fund that we do regularly. And I think that has been very, very successful, and polio is almost eradicated, not just from our money, but from many people's money, not least Bill Gates, who he also spends more money on international development than we do, which is quite staggering that a single man and his wife could be doing this without, they don't have in the same way the bureaucracy that we do. But I have great worries about the large charities. I mean, I stopped a long time from going to the dinners that Oxfam were putting on because I felt that they should not be going to such lavish restaurants. They should not be spending so much on wine. Not that I'm going to turn wine down, but I just felt it was wrong that they were spending so much money entertaining members of Parliament, lots of members of Parliament, But actually, at the time, they were only really wanting to talk to one party, and it wasn't us. So I stopped going because I felt that there was a corruption there. I don't mean corruption in terms of fiddling money, but spending money that they should have been spending on people out there. And I also resented the fact that when it turned out that they had been using prostitutes in Haiti, that they were saying, well, it's only prostitutes, you know, it's fine. It's legal in that country, but prostitutes are victims. How many people in this room went to school with somebody that said, when I grow up, I want to be a prostitute? It's because they've become victims of the society that they live in, that they have had to go down that route. And in Haiti and in other countries where there's been a disaster, those women haven't chosen to do it. They're doing it because they have no choice, because they need the aid to feed their families. So I was very angry about that. I was very angry with Save the Children. But there are people who seem to think it's okay, they're away from home for a very long time. You know, they really should be allowed to do what they want, these men. Well, I don't think they should. If they can't keep their trousers zipped up for 6 months at a time, then I feel very sorry for them. And they should leave these girls alone, and they should not be predators on girls and women who are desperate for help. And we have got a lot of people in the world who are desperate for help, and there is real poverty out there. But I completely disagree with doing bilateral work with governments in individual countries, because that is where it goes wrong. I think we need to do it through institutions, but not these huge ones. They've got far, far too big in my view. So I like to see us dealing with smaller organisations that haven't become so inflated, where when somebody feels they have to resign from one position that covers Britain, gets promoted and does the one that's around the world. It's international chairman of an organisation. I think that's completely wrong. If they've had to resign, they should resign from everything, and they should not be in charge. So I feel very passionately that we need to clear up the fact of the international industry, because as Priti said, it is huge. And although I do believe in aid, I think we can do a much better service for the people that we're trying to serve by not allowing these inflated organisations to handle as much money as we do. But there's a problem. If we're stuck with 0.7% that we have to spend, and you have to almost chuck it at the organisations in the last couple of months because the year end's coming up, but how on earth do we know how much the GNI is when we haven't got to the end of the financial year? I think it should be lagged, it should be a year behind, so that we know exactly how much we should spend. I signed up to the 0.7%, but I was very uncomfortable about doing so, because I feel if we've got a growing economy, we've got more and more money to spend. And we have had a growing economy, so more money is going out of the door. And there are many people, as Ian said, who feel we should be spending it locally, propping up the services here. But I do feel with the environmental challenges that we have around the world, we actually need to look at those as well, that can help Britain by clearing up the mess that's happening in other countries. I recently went to Bangladesh to see the Rohingya refugee camps, and Bangladesh could be a beautiful country, could have huge amounts of tourism, but on the beaches there's piles of plastic, waste plastic this high, that is right along the beaches. Nobody's going to go and sit on the beach, it's so filthy. We can help create jobs and help clear those beaches. They might have a better chance at developing their country and achieving a better income for all of their people. So we can do it creatively, and I do think Priti is looking at it, Penny is looking at it in a slightly different way, and this is not a criticism of Priti, because she did a really good job when she was there. But I think we need to look at it more creatively. And I think Penny Morden is doing that, and that's what we need to all back.
Thank you. Your point's something that I want to pull out later about how we define, how we hit that 0.7%, and whether things that are not necessarily considered overseas development today might well be worthwhile rolling into the target in the future. Theo Clarke, who is the founder and CEO of the brilliantly named Coalition for Global Prosperity, which I think is known as setting a bar quite high, which is supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Formerly the director of Conservative Friends of International Development, someone who's worked in Rwanda, Tanzania, Sierra Leone, so knows her onions. So Theo, over to you.
Thank you very much, and I'm so pleased that the TPA are doing this debate, who spoke at our event yesterday, so I'm delighted to return the favour, James. Well, I take it I'm here to do a strong, robust defence of aid, so I will do my best. First of all, let me start off by saying that I do believe that Britain is a force for good in the world, and I think that it is right that we are spending money overseas, and I'm a strong supporter of us spending 0.7% of that on foreign aid. And I was really pleased that when the Prime Minister recently went to Africa, she said that aid works and she reconfirms that commitment. And let me start off by just reminding us in this room of the tremendous progress that has been made on tackling poverty, because I don't think we do a good enough job of telling the public how much has been done in the last few years. So if you look back in 1966, 50% of the world's population was living on less than $2 a day. Let's look at that figure from last year in 2017, and it's reduced to just 9% of the world's population. So we've made tremendous progress in reducing global poverty, and we should be telling that story better. And I wanted to start off by talking about why I think that aid, first of all, is a good thing, but I think also why investing it is in the national interest. First of all, aid is the right thing to do. And I saw some recent polling from the public which says that 86% of people do agree with that. And we should also remember that in the recent general election manifestos, all of the major political parties signed up to point 7, and we had political consensus on that. Well, I absolutely agree with the panellists. We need to have value for the aid budget, and I never tire of telling the NGOs that it's taxpayer money, not government money, that we're spending. You need to make sure that we are getting value for it, and every penny in that pound is getting to the world's poorest people. So I think the key for me is how are we prioritising what government spending is being used on. And I just wanted to use 2 examples of things I recently visited. And the first is what we've done with tackling pandemics and Ebola. I went out to work in Sierra Leone both before the crisis and after the pandemic had struck. And I met with the Sierra Leonean health minister, and he basically said that if Britain hadn't turned up when we did, we were literally the first on the plane, we scaled up our response, we set up the hospitals outside of Freetown, we were providing the quarantine zones, the expertise, the skills, literally at the forefront of that response. We would have had a major global disaster. And we have to remember that pandemics don't respect borders. It just takes a few people to get on one aeroplane from Freetown to London, and we could have had that problem here in Britain. So I absolutely believe that we should be spending money upstream. It's about prevention before these disasters get here to Britain. And I think that is a great example of aid money being used very well. And I also just got back from Tanzania a few weeks ago visiting a few different programmes, and I was shown a really interesting programme by the National Crime Agency. And let's look at an issue like drug smuggling. So we have huge problems of drugs in Britain today with heroin and cocaine on the streets. So let's think about how those drugs are getting to Britain. So when I was in Dar es Salaam a few weeks ago, they'd literally just captured several dhows, which are the sailing boats which had just come to the Swahili coast from Zanzibar Island. And this is the British government spending money and sending out our experts to go and help the Kenyan and Tanzanian authorities to capture millions of pounds of illicit drugs which are being trafficked to Africa, which are going to make their way to Europe and ultimately end here on the streets in Birmingham. So should the government be preventing that? Absolutely, that is a good use of our aid money. And I totally agree with what Priti said about how we must make sure that other government departments are spending the money well. There was a recent report done by the International Development Committee in June, and it reviewed all the spending by government departments which spend over 0.7. And actually they said that DFID spends the money really well. It was actually held up as one of the most transparent and the most scrutinised departments in government as an example for other government departments. And I have concerns that other government departments are not spending the money as well, whether it's the Foreign Office or the Ministry of Defence. So I think we must have more joined up thinking. But I've been really pleased that I think under Penny we have had this kind of reset. She's working very hard to build relationships with the other government departments. And I met with the Foreign Office recently, and they gave me a good example of how we are being more joined up on the ground. So let's take, for example, northeast Nigeria. A British government strategic priority in that region is national security. So let's look at what that means on the actual ground. You've got, for example, the local police, who who are being trained by the National Crime Agency from Britain. Then you've got DFID, who are working with the families of the Chibok girls that were kidnapped and their families. So this is literally different government departments, but all under Point 7, who are working together on a strategic priority in a region that we want to work on. And I think that's a really good example. And lastly, I just wanted to pick up on the point about migration. I mean, I've been to visit 5 refugee camps in the last year. I've also been to Cox's Bazar like Pauline. And we have 65 million people today who are on the move and not at home. That is the largest scale of migration that we have seen since World War II. And that problem is not going away. I went to Jordan, to the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon as well, just on the border of Syria. And there are literally 1 in 4 people in Lebanon today is a refugee or internally displaced person. Can you imagine if we had that proportion of people arriving here in Britain? So I think it's right that Britain is spending money in the Syria region and was at the forefront of that response, providing desperate resources to people who literally have fled from Homs and Aleppo cities which are reduced to rubble. There is no job to go to, there is no hospital, there is no water, there is no schools. And I think Britain should be proud of the role that we've played in that. And lastly, I just want to say, and this is going to sound surprising, that I'm actually delighted that people like Ian are here and that the Taxpayers Alliance are hosting this event. Because, I think we've got to make sure that aid money is being scrutinised and it is being well spent. So I'm a great believer in the aid budget, and I think it is spent well. But I think we are right to have a free press uncovering scandals. We are right to have people calling out if projects are not being spent and tackle on the right problems. And that's why it's so good that we're having panel discussions like today to talk about that. So lastly, I'd just like to say, the government has talked a lot about this Global Britain strategy, how we want to be more outward-looking after Brexit next year. Well, let's talk about soft power. Let's talk about development, Britain flying the flag around the world, because that's one of the things we do best. We are a development superpower. So while I'd never try to claim that aid is this silver bullet which is going to tackle all the world's problems, I do think that alongside our kind of active diplomacy, our strategy for defence, and alongside free trade, it does make Britain have this tremendous potential to be a force for good in the world, and it does help make us healthier, safer and better off.
Compelling case, and thank you for sticking up for the free press. Having been at Labour conference last week in Liverpool, I can assure you that not everybody is so thrilled about our ability to hold power to account. I will now hand over to TPA's James Price, campaign manager over at the TPA. I'm allowed to take the mic because I used to do his job, who has been at TPA for going on 2 years now, and a prominent campaigner for taxpayer money value. Over to you, James.
Thank you very much. Yeah, as Theo said, that I did this leg yesterday, so this is like the second leg of a Champions League match for Theo and I today. But we'll find out. But as I'm now on home turf, I think it would be remiss of me in the ThinkTent not to point out that the development that you were talking about of people being lifted out of poverty is not, of course, primarily aid. Of course, it's primarily the growth and acceptance of competition and free enterprise and fundamentally capitalism around the world that is for hundreds of millions of people. I think I'm safe to say that in here of all places. The big question we're looking at is about value in this. And so, firstly on the 0.7%, I think we've heard some good arguments back and forth for it. It's a bit of a counterfactual. Has the 0.7% helped give more or less value if that target weren't there? It may very well be that if you can make a brilliant case for it, that the public could get behind the equivalent of 0.8%, perhaps. But I think that the priorities and the focus and the industry that's been built up around that arbitrary target has probably held back the progress and development of getting value in that 0.7%. And also, since we've adopted it, an open question, you can Google it, how many other countries have adopted 0.7% themselves? It's not very many. The Foreign Office, and maybe I'll get fired for saying this, I mentioned it briefly yesterday, I don't think maybe the Foreign Office is one of the few areas that doesn't see as much money as perhaps it would need. Moving some of that 0.7% spend into some kind of strategy around the Foreign Office so that there are ideas on the ground there and spreading out some of that knowledge, or at least having the Foreign Office and DFID and I think the wonderful Department for International Trade all talking together, all thinking together, and then bringing some of the charities that are represented in the room and actually talking to each other at cross purposes and having an improved bilateral relationship between the UK and all these various other countries, I think that's a wonderful sort of potential way of getting around some of these perhaps increasingly defunct multilateral organisations, or at the very least the threat of defunding to some of them might make them a little bit more shipshape. One thing I wanted to talk about a little bit, because we've got charities in the room, I think it's, I'm definitely get fired for this, Portia in The Merchant of Venice, who says that charity is twice blessed. It blesses he who gives and he who receives. And with the UK under a 49-year high tax burden, it's wonderful that Brits are still so unbelievably generous and still, after all that tax, give a huge amount of money to charity. I think, and I have to say this to TPA, if we were to cut taxes, I absolutely believe that people would give even more money to charity than they do. And people would, instead of abnegating, feeling an abnegation of responsibility because they already pay so much tax and see stories in newspapers but not being well spent, there would be more support for giving money to these charities, and people then rightly feeling good about the moral action they're taking in the world. And lastly as well, of course, we have to remember that we are as a country still in tens of billions of pounds of deficit. The national debt may even hit 2 trillion at some point, and that's before you look at really exciting things like public sector pension liabilities and things like that. That's all money that's going to be tax deferred to the children and great-great-grandchildren of people in the room. So we have to remember, as I said yesterday, quoting a certain other Conservative politician, pennies don't fall from heaven, they do have to be earned here on earth. And I think that that's something that the public remember even better than all of us at this conference. One other last thing on migration, a really good idea that came out yesterday, if we're looking at Britain's moral role in the world and its ability to lead on things, how about the idea, just as a final thought, taking in something like, this is an Adam Smith Institute idea that came out yesterday, taking in something like 10,000 people a year as refugees from Venezuela, because that is a country that has suffered unbelievably from some absolutely terrible and horrendous policies. And that's one example that we can show a kind of moral leadership in the world and set an example there, as well as all the other good stuff that we could be doing. So that's something hopefully a little bit controversial that can get some questions going. And thank you all for coming.